Friends, as you're joining us, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat feature, I'll lead by example and just share. My name is Abby Prince. I'm at LeaderShape. I'll do more of an introduction when everyone joins us. I use she, her pronouns. And if you are comfortable doing the same, then sharing the lands on which you're joining us from today. Where are the first peoples that are on the lands where you're joining us from today? So I'll share that in the chat with you all here. Thanks everyone who's joining us there. If you're able to introduce yourself in the chat, we'd like to know who's with us and where are you from. It's I think that's so nice that we can all connect over Zoom in these ways, that we've been able to still build community in these spaces and meet virtually in these ways. And it's always nice to know where people are in the world as you're joining us too. It's noon for us here in Central Illinois, but maybe it's post or pre-lunch where you are. We know that it is over the lunch hour though, probably, or a snack time at least. So if you feel that you need to grab a meal and nourish yourselves as we're joining us, you can certainly do that. You will definitely be nourished mentally throughout our conversation with Becky and Sanja that are joining us. I'll do more formal introductions as we kind of lean into our time together, but just kind of informally as folks are joining us, make sure that you're introducing yourself in the chat feature. We've been doing these sessions for, gosh, I think since the first summer of the pandemic. Kristen, if you can check me on that, but just in kind of about once a month, bringing folks together over the lunch hour to talk about a topic that relates to our leadership educator friends. And so as we do that, as we spend time here together, Zoom is likely a platform that's familiar to you all, but I will offer this guidance for you here as you're familiarizing yourself with our space. If you want to keep yourself muted or cameras off, you're welcome to do so. If you have questions and you want to share them in the chat, either broadly for everyone to see or privately for Becky or Sanja and I to see, you're welcome to do so as well. And we can anonymously share those to the group. I will also offer a land acknowledgement here today, as I know as we started to introduce ourselves and share from where we're joining, the lands from which we're joining. I just offer a land acknowledgement here and thinking about the sky, the land, and the sea around us, and who shared this space and who lived on this land before we were here and who cultivated those spaces. So I will offer a land acknowledgement for you here and thinking about where you're joining from. If you're new to LeaderShape, if you're learning about our space here, LeaderShape is a nonprofit organization with a vision of creating a just, caring, and thriving world where all lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. And one of the ways in which we invite that is through conversations like this, through learning from others and seeing ourselves as teachers and learners and expanding our minds on new topics every day. And so as we think about this space and this hour that we have together, we will offer a definition of leadership along this way as well, and thinking about who we are in this community of learners and doing this work to result in a more equitable society. I'm truly excited to be joined by Dr. Becky Martinez and Dr. Sanja Ardwa as we think about this topic of social class. These two educators have done so much work around this topic of social class and helping us figure out who we are in that space and what it looks like to straddle these different classes throughout our lives. And I'm excited to learn alongside them, alongside all of you today as we think about navigating COVID and the recession through social class. We've been through a lot in these last couple of years for sure. And so I'm excited to learn from Becky and Sanja as we have this conversation here today. And friends, I will turn things over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for being here and investing an hour of your time. As we put in the chat, we invite you to be on video because we know this is such an intimate thing to talk about. Even if you're like mid-bite, that's okay. Dr. Becky Martinez, she, her, and hers. And I am in the original land of the ancestral people of the Coy and Luiseño, which is now Hemet, California, so southeast, Southern California. Thank you for being here, and have Sanja put her voice in.
Yes, I am excited to be in good company today with all of you, but also with LeaderShape and with my friend and colleague, Dr. Becky Martinez. My name is Sandra Ardway. I use she, her pronouns. I am joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Sugary, Catawba, and Cherokee East peoples, which is now known as Dallas, North Carolina. There is a Dallas in North Carolina. I work at Clemson University as a faculty member as my day job, and social class and the topics therein are part of not only my research agenda, but also my lived experience. So always happy to be in conversation about this topic, even when it's tough.
Yes. So, Abby, thank you for, as you introduced, talking about we're still in the pandemic. So even as we think about social class, right, and navigating COVID, increasing costs of all of the things, knowing that we are still in a space and we're figuring out what that means. And as we think about a social class lens, we're going to spend this hour in reflection and in some conversation, giving you some things to think about, giving us some things to think about, to take back to your communities on campus, in your home, with your friends. And so we have some polling questions, right, to get us engaged. And Abby will put those up for us. Right. So we want to know a little bit about your context. Right? As we think about context before content, where are you all coming from in our work lens, at least? So we'll just spend a little bit of time as folks are filling that out. I love this something else. I feel like I really want to know what that is. So, right, some lots of 4-year private, 4-year public. Oh no, 4-year public, 4-year private, right? Nonprofit. Thanks for joining us. Yes. Something else. So really important to think about what is the lens in which I am engaging social class from my role. And what do I pay attention to and know, and how do we talk about that? All right, I think that we've got about 82% participated, so we'll probably go to the next poll. Right, so what is the level of comfort in discussing social class impacts at work? So think about it from I am in my workspace with colleagues, with students, with peers, with clients. I can talk with comfort, but not more than that. I get you on that one. Right? Engage basic conversation with students, but tend to avoid social class topics with colleagues. Right? Comfortable and willing to engage in most workspaces, and I'm ready. Let's talk class anytime, anywhere. Just give that a few more seconds to populate. And what Sandra and I invite you to do is no judgment. Right? Like no judgment of where we are at as we engage social class and what our comfort is. Because I know that today I could be really comfortable and tomorrow could be the context changes and the day changes and I could be less comfortable. Okay. Okay. So share results. There we are. And then next poll. Right. So what is your comfort in talking about this stuff at home, right? With the folks that you know and care about and the folks that you know and know you, right? So no, thank you. Only if you force me. And can engage basic conversation about bills or budget with partner or roommates. I'm comfortable and willing to engage with immediate family, but I tend to avoid broader social class topics with extended family, loved ones. Right. I think about when you're sitting at the dinner table, right? Or that reunion, or you're out to dinner with a friend, or you're talking about buying a car, right? The ways in which we can talk about that, right? I'm ready. Let's talk class anytime, anywhere.
So
just
a little
go
more
ahead.
comfort here than in the workspace is what I'm noticing. Especially at those sort of I'm really ready, let's do it, let's get into it. Looks like, because those sort of latter categories in the work one were about 50%, and here they're almost 90. So it's an interesting observation.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. And we just want you to reflect your answers, where you've been, where you're at, how deep we're going to go today, what you can relate to, what's new, what would you add? And I think we're going to have Sanja go. Yep. Thank you.
So we have looked at, as we were thinking about this conversation, we thought about what are some guiding questions for our conversation. And we've prepared sort of some content around these guiding questions, but also welcome your questions, counterpoints, challenges, affirmations as part of this conversation today as well. And so thinking about why is it important to talk about social class in its broadest form? Because we often take a reductionistic approach when talking about social class. That's my GRE word for the day. And then what makes it complex to talk about, whether that's at work or at home? It seems that at least for the folks gathered here today, it might be a little more challenging in the workspace than the home space, but in general, it can be a complex thing to chat about. So looking at that, spending sort of the bulk of our time thinking about how COVID and the rising cost of living across the country have made it both easier potentially or difficult to discuss and address social class, because sometimes these inflection points lead us to talk about it more because it's in our face. And sometimes it also makes it more challenging to talk about in that same process because it might be a harder life space to be in as well. And then thinking about in what ways are in the higher ed space that most of us seem to be working in, but really in any space that we're working in, living in, how are we aiding folks in navigating social class in those spaces? And what else could we be doing? Because sometimes it's easier for us, and we like to, in organizational spaces, say, here, look at all the things I'm doing, and not, here's all the shit I'm not doing. And so how are we looking at the both and there of we're doing some stuff and maybe we could be doing some stuff better. And so those are the sort of the topics we want to explore. What is the broadness? Why it can be challenging to talk about? How are these inflection points creating a squeeze on social class identity? And then what can we do about it? And so that's really where we're going today.
Awesome. Thanks, Sanja. And with that, we want to spend some time talking about, thinking about and talking about social class broadly. Some of you have been with us in another LeaderShape session, possibly, or in a workshop. And we just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what is social class. So Abby, if we can get the next slide up here. Lots of forms, different forms of capital. And we know that most people enter a class space from money, assets, wealth, lack thereof money, right? The things that are tangible, we can see what the paychecks are if we are privileged enough to receive those. Right? So that financial capital, right? What we often, what's often referred to as SES, and I think Sanja and I invite you to use a different term so that we can broaden social class, right? And then these other forms of capital, right? Cultural capitals, information we know, how, if we think about it within higher ed, understanding systems, or in the nonprofit world, like understanding the systems and being able to navigate those with as much ease as possible. One of the things that has come up for me in regards to class is ease. Right? So what are the degrees of ease that these capitals give me or don't give me, or our students or our clients or the folks that we serve or our colleagues, right? And ease is such a easy and challenging concept, especially as I have more social capital and cultural capital than I used to, right? Social capital, who knows you and who you know. Sanja and I just didn't end up here on these screens with you, but we know folks and folks know us. And so the invite to be able to engage in something that is so near to us and important in our work around inclusion and access and what that means. And then we have like linguistic capital and academic capital. So linguistic, accents, word choice, profanity, if I can say bullshit or not, or where that puts me in, right? Whose context, which context is okay to use what words and what language. And that varies. And so even as we have mostly higher ed folks and one nonprofit person, very different forms of language is often used, right? And so how are we paying attention to our linguistic capital and what words we know? I love my friends who aren't in the social justice spaces and they're like, oh, you're using your big social justice words today. I'm like, shit, you're right. And so the fluidity that class can also bring, and then academic capital, right? As we think about degrees, where from, what is it in, what college do we work in, what are we teaching, what college in which are we teaching, how do we credential ourselves when we meet each other? We got our big old name badges at particular conferences, and what is all put on that in relation to academic capital. So, yep, I can be proud and honor, and it comes with the level of class, right? From both how it's internalized, but also how it's perceived. And that I think is a beauty around social class, is that it doesn't just involve our current class, it involves our class of origin, and then how people perceive us. If they know our degrees, they know the what our titles are, they know what we drive, they know how we speak, all of those pieces. So want to introduce this as we think about social class broadly and all of the forms of capital. And there are some examples of how it shows up, whether it is what shoes we wear. I just bought my dad a pair of work shoes probably like 6 months ago, and he sends me a picture about every 3 weeks and saying, these are the best work shoes that I've ever had. Right? And they are dirty and they are muddy, and I don't have those same shoes. Right. So there's a lot of reflection in regards to how we show up from a clothes, shoes, when we shower, what that means. If we work out or not. I know a lot of laborers who don't have a gym membership because they don't need one. And I'm gonna, if Abby if it's okay for you, I'm gonna actually invite you on, because you said some stuff as we were prepping. I think it's really important.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. I with Sanja and Becky and I were chatting before the session started, and I was sharing with them, and partly in a reflection from this conversation around social class and what I've learned from the two of you, and thinking about when I was a kid growing up, working class, and my dad would come home from his labor job and smelling like dirt and oil. And that was such a good smell to me. Like, dad's home. It means that we're like, let's start homework and let's make dinner and let's all have family time together. And I know that that is a smell that maybe that's not associated as something good, depending on what class you're from, but that always had such a positive influence in me. But thinking about like how smell is related to class as well, that was something that really struck me through our previous conversations around class too.
Yeah.
And I'll add too that I've been thinking a lot. I'm expecting our first child, and how early this starts, right?
Mhm.
Like, we're touring daycares this morning, and I was thinking about academic capital. What is the curriculum in each of these daycares? What do they offer? What are they teaching? And my baby's in utero, right? Like, it's not like out in the world living. And so thinking about not only how early it starts, but then how it accumulates over time, and then creates advantages and privileges for people who are attaining the forms of capital that are most celebrated or expected in society as well.
Yeah, right. So Sanchez, I hear that is generational wealth.
Yes.
Right. And in our book, I know that Dr. Mantha Akapati talks about generational wealth is more than money. And so the information that's shared, the knowledge that we have, so that when you go to daycare with your 2.5-page document of questions,
Which I did.
which you did, like there's something that's important about that and means something. Whereas somebody, right, could be like, I just want to know if you can take care of my child from like 8 to 4.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
And that's the exact question my partner and I were having, because neither of us went to formal daycares. Like, he stayed with his grandparent. I went to like a local person's house, right? Both of us went to public K to the end of our educational pathway schools. And so then you debate with yourself on how much does it actually matter, right? Particularly with our backgrounds, and I identify as a class straddler, and I know you do too, Becky. And so like, what does that mean as I debate on how much capital and how much advantage to give my kid? And I struggle with some of those things.
Yeah, so appreciate that. So we wanted to just have you do some reflection on class. And we know that there are different kinds of capital, right? That's why we have and more. I was in a session probably like 3 or 4 months ago, and somebody was talking about like emotional capital. And what that could mean, engaging it from a social class lens. And so we know that we will just continue to add to the space of capital and how it impacts us and those around of us. We now want to talk about, which we'll probably spend a lot of time on, the current squeeze on social class. And knowing that there is COVID for 3 years, there is the rising cost of living. And Sanja and I had a conversation yesterday of, do we say recession? Because we know that could put people in a spin, that could land on people in certain ways, right? And it is like, are we talking about it from the government lens? Are we talking about it from like the sociological lens, right? And so we're using the more neutral term, rising cost of living, although my real estate agent would say we've been in a recession for about 6 or 7 months. And so again, context matters. And then the squeeze on social class. And so there's the immediate things as we think about economic capital or financial capital, right? Like, currently eggs and the shelves are empty, and I love me some eggs and I'm conscious of what that cost. And as well as other things like gas. I live in California. The other day I went to go fill up my tank, and it was only $4.69 a gallon. And that's what I said. Oh, it's only $4.69 today. And how that has ebbed and flowed throughout the last 3 years. There were moments that it was $2.69, and I was like, yes, but I also wasn't driving anywhere. And so, as we think about the costs that are coming out of our pockets, out of students' pockets, out of colleagues' pockets, right? Especially if we look at the laborers on our campuses or in our organization, where that extra 25 cents really means a lot per gallon. Mm-hmm. Or eggs were cheap, and that's how I would feed my family in the morning. And now now that's not the case. Right? Or students commuting from campus, or our employees commuting into our organization or campuses. And what does that mean? Can we go to campus as often, especially if we have late night programs and we want students or the campus to come and to learn, and not being able to do that, or needing to be conscious of how we provide learning and programs in different ways because of this squeeze. I'll go to the student loan forgiveness, right? Big topic we have in life, not just in higher education. It could impact us personally, our kids, our family members, our friends. And we know that there is a roller coaster of agreement on if that should happen or not, and on if it's going to happen or not. Right. And reading all of the information around how it could impact people's lives, to buying a house, to being able to afford health insurance, to being able to buy groceries. And so as we think about some of those costs related to higher education, I'm going to invite Sanja in here to talk about some more, and then we could probably just play off of each other.
Yeah, and I'll invite folks, if you have thoughts on this or ways that you're seeing sort of the squeeze on your campus, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll sort of incorporate those into the conversation, or just hearing your perspective and sharing it, I think can be really useful. And I appreciate this graphic, because I think both of these things are squeezing social class identity. And due to my lack of ability to create more better graphics, they're not necessarily separate, right? No. They play together. COVID has caused some of the rising cost of living in a lot of people's lives, or a reduction in their income or money in. as well as the money out. And so thinking about sort of what does that mean for students or colleagues who are working multiple jobs or who lost their jobs. And, I think there is a assumption that, oh, there's plenty of jobs right now. Everybody's hiring. But what does that mean for time? What does that mean for income? What does that mean for all these other pieces? And the same thing with for some students for the financial capital aspects of tuition may be the same, or you may say the program we offer is free. We are offering a free leadership conference. Why ain't people come to this free leadership conference? But then thinking about, well, that to Becky's point, that might cost them gas to get there. It might cost them time off work. It might cost them childcare or elder care. It might cost them. And so what are those other costs? And so thinking about the, or even like linguistic capital, maybe their linguistic capital is not as accepted in that space. And so they're not willing to compromise that linguistic capital for the social capital they might gain from that. And so people are sort of often making these analyses or assessments about what are in some ways the cost benefit capital analysis. I don't know if that's a real term. Somebody can like Google that and see if it's on Google Scholar and in some kind of literature, but it's really thinking about if I'm trying to add to my bucket of capital in some of these ways, what is it costing me in these other buckets of capital? And so thinking about that, because it's not always about money. I mean, sometimes it absolutely is, right? If we did student loan forgiveness, if we had free tuition, like all of those things would be helpful. Yes. And it doesn't necessarily eradicate the other challenges that people are experiencing in our spaces. And so thinking about all of these pieces, because many campuses have done great work around basic needs supports. And right, that need has been elevated through COVID. And I think it's going to continue to elevate through these rising costs of living. And so I was talking to a colleague the other day who works at a community college here in North Carolina and was talking about, hey, we just made this partnership with the CSA so we can have fresh fruits, vegetables, and meats for students who are experiencing food insecurity. And that's amazing. And one of my thoughts was, are you also doing that for the people who work on your campus? Because there's also needs there, because we know what we pay people, sometimes less than we should. But at public institutions, we know what we pay people. And so we know what that means. And sometimes our programs and services are limited to students because we do have limited resources. And so it's a push and pull for some of these things to think about how it's impacting. So now, sometimes if we have COVID, we're out of work. What does that mean, right? Or we're out of class. What does that mean? Because some campuses have kept sort of multimodality sort of components to learning, work, et cetera, and some haven't. And so what, again, is that combination mean for people's social class identity? And so there's lots, I think, of pieces of the squeeze here on social class identity and the variant forms of capital that Becky was talking about from both the COVID experience that we are continuing to have, as well as the rising costs of living that we're experiencing in different ways in each of our contexts, depending on where we live and where we work as well.
And I think some of the ads, Sanja, are what for some folks, they have lost family members, yes, right? Or folks that have contributed in an all kinds of capital space. And are we within our organization or campus creating space to talk about that? As we think about sense of belonging or connection, or dealing, with anxiety or mental health, or I don't have enough money because my aunt used to help me pay this and they passed away as a result of COVID. And now I don't know what to do. And we know that as we don't talk about class, we're building that capacity to do that. Can a student or a colleague feel comfortable enough to bring that up? Right. And can somebody receive it? Right. To be able to be like, okay, how can I support this person, deal with my own stuff that's going on, and provide some resources?
And as I think about too, like leadership learning and how people engage in leadership learning, a lot of it's co-curricular, right? So conferences, institutes, LeaderShape's programs, some of it is more academic curriculum, right? It might be an extra course or a minor or those sorts of things. and who has access to those things and who doesn't, by way of some of these forms of capital. So how are we creating these things to be welcoming to students of different social classes, but then also how do we recognize where the gaps are, and do we have the potential to fill some of those gaps? Because some of those things have long lasting impacts, right? So to Adrian's point in the chat about the interaction between time and money, like who has the ability to say, I'm going to take these 4 days off to go to the Institute, right? Or I'm going to take this 1 day off to go to Catalyst, or I'm going to do a unpaid internship, right? Like all of those things are sort of adding to people's forms of capital. And we know that that can make them more attractive in the job market. And so how people can invest, whether it's time, money, people, those sorts of different resources, does sort of have this long-term impact. So if we are thinking sort of, if we build it, they will come, I don't think that is a good approach, because people have different capacities by which they can engage. So how are we thinking about ways to continue some of those things, but either A, make them more accessible, or B, also build them in additional ways so that folks can gain those same leadership capacities, leadership efficacy, that then they can take that into whatever other home and workspaces they're going to enter post certificate, post degree, those sorts of things.
Yeah. And as Adrian put in there around values, right? Adrian, I appreciate that. Like there's sometimes this dissonance or tension between values and time. Right. And so what do I value, even in a leadership capacity, to dedicate my time to, right? Or to invest my time to, or to seek that out. And, for some folks that could be going to a traditional, right, or a typical leadership program. Or it could be like, I've got to go back to my community because I value that so much. And so that's how I'm spending my time. And that may seem less valuable, right, on paper. And how are we how are we building our capacity to talk about that in our offices, and come up with a certificate program, right, that doesn't fit this kind of standardized certificate program, right? Where you need the signature, you got to show up there. And so how does going back to community, part of the value system, especially for poor working class folks, right? Working class students, and have that be their focus and space. Adrian, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually just wanted to clarify, I was actually thinking about it in a slightly different capacity, but then your comments made me have a question around that. So if I could, the time money thing is something that I think about more in a personal aspect. So like I live with a roommate, for example, and like she doesn't like to cook. So she will pay extra to buy cut up vegetables, whereas like I would never do that. Yeah. I'm shopping the sales, I'm willing to like chop my own vegetables, etc. Even we had like a water damage issue in our basement, and again, sort of 95% of her stuff was affected and only like 5% of my stuff was affected, but like I wanted to put the claim in on our renter's insurance, and she was just like, it's not worth it, kind of thing. So like the idea of like how valuable, quote unquote, is your time, or how much time do you spend to find some of those things, like was something that I've been thinking about. But in terms of the professional development, that is something, and again, as a doc student who's on a student stipend, like don't make a ton. And that is something that has been, I think, as part of COVID, one of the first things to be cut was people's professional development funds, and those kinds of things. And there's like a lot of narratives, right, of like, well, you have to invest in yourself. And like, so I just am curious about your thoughts around like professional development funds, and like whose quote unquote responsibility is it, if there is a responsibility even, and yeah, just kind of the ways in which we treat human development in higher education, which we claim to help with human and student development.
It's quite a paradox, right? So first, I want to thank you for like bringing it to a really personal level. And so I was like, oh, Adrienne, thank you. Cause I don't like, we can get into this like intellectualized or like professional space, and right, that squeeze can often happen also in our home spaces, right? So how do I spend my time? Do I cut the vegetables? Don't I cut the vegetables, right? Do I clean my house? Do I get my house clean? Do I wash my car, right? Do I go through the drive-through car wash? Do I go through a car wash in which I get out and it takes an hour and a half, right? So all of those little things aren't so little. And how do we talk about that with our colleagues? Like, how are we building our capacity to have like real class conversations with students, with colleagues, with peers, with the parents of students, right? All of those pieces really important in a class conversation. And then leadership has responsibility of what does our professional development look like? Who is that coming from? Like, so we can look at it organizationally. Is it happening across the organization? Is it happening like with like around positionality? How is leadership advocating? I'll be really honest with you. There's a lot of money out there right now for what is priority and what we like and what we deem priority. And it doesn't mean that there's not budget. So I want to say that in my experience as a consultant is there's a lot of campuses that are willing to value, right, inclusion, diversity, belonging, and professional development is a part of that. Right. And so how are we reframing what professional development looks like? What are maybe some expectations that we're setting? And how are we either providing the money, right, to do that, or the time or the resources? How are we looking at, from a leadership perspective, what is cost effective, right? Or what could be easier that we can do it virtually rather than needing to go to like an in-person conference? How are we defining professional development? I think is another thing, right? Does it have to be in an institute or a conference? Can it be that I'm going to go to something regionally that a nonprofit's putting on, and it doesn't really fit in the space? And then the other level of professional development is like, even what states does our institution pay for or not pay for, given what is going on in the context of identity? Right. Those are some of my thoughts, Sanja.
Yeah. And I appreciate that clarification too, Adrienne. And as you're talking, I thought about things like, I still will book flights that are like 6 a.m. or 9 p.m. because I want to save the $50, right? And I have colleagues, Becky's one of them, but Dr. Jeremiah is another, who like, what are you doing to yourself? Like, is your time, is your 3-hour layover or whatever worth that $50? And I think that's a hard determination for me, because I'm like, I could sit in the airport for 3 hours. Like, that's just fine. I really struggled at first when we hired some local folks to clean our house, because I thought, how many hours is that taking out of my month? They come once a month, versus like if I did it right. And like, what does that mean for my teaching prep and my writing and like all of those things? And so I've really made some what people would think are not consistent decisions about how time and money sort of play out for me. And so I think that can be really complicated for people, whereas other people are like you mentioned, or Becky mentioned earlier, about ease. Like, if it is the route that gets me more time with my partner or my work or people I care for, my pets or whatever, then they're willing to do it. And so I think that is something I think people struggle with. And particularly as we talk about having this conversation with siblings, or having this conversation with colleagues or roommates or partners, or like all of those sorts of things, because sometimes one party values that time more than the money, and sometimes they value the money more than the time. And so I think that gets us into a lot of sort of tough conversations, but also like figuring out how to meld lives with other people in whatever way we're sharing space and sort of time with them. From the professional development lens, I think it's multiple things. I think even on this call, as I was looking at where people are coming from, I thought, I wonder if people at 4-year institutions are having more capacity to engage in professional development than people at 2-year institutions, because that's how it sort of shook out in the poll. And And I was at a 2-year institution up in Minnesota earlier this month, and then they were talking about how, our workload's 100% everything. It's not like X% research, teaching, service, or like those things. It's like 100% everything. And people are wearing doing multiple roles and all of those sorts of things. And it's like one of the most, or is the most well-resourced, largest community colleges in Minnesota. And then I think I've had primarily 4-year experiences. And so what does that look like at a public versus a private? To your point, what gets cut? And so stipends and GA positions are often on the chopping block as the first thing. Sometimes so are student affairs related programs and services. And so thinking about what does that then trickle down for? And then what do people saying it's a replacement, right? Does the institution offer free tuition for courses? Because then they're like, well, can be professional development. Take a sociology course, take a business course, like those sorts of things. And that's sort of built in. Other institutions don't have that capacity. 2-year institutions may not offer sort of the types of courses the employee may be interested in, those sorts of things. And so I think some of those pieces, and I think our brains are trained and our system, what's the word I'm looking for? Advantages like conferences, right? So like we're trained to believe that is professional development, like synonymously, and we're trained to believe, or when we see it on a job applicant, it is more recognizable perhaps than I audited X course or I read these 10 books or whatever. And so I think it's a both and when it comes to responsibility, which is probably like the easy way out of that answer. But thinking about what can I be doing? Like one of my best professional development endeavors was one summer, I read 8 pedagogy books, and it really was beneficial to me. Right. And I can put that on my, end of year evaluation. Like it's not traditional professional development, to Becky's point. Or maybe it's not the first thing people think about, but it was highly beneficial to my practice in terms of both sort of equity and inclusion, but also just general practice around pedagogy. And so those are some of the initial things I thought about.
Yeah. Sandra, I love the conversation around flight costs. And it still takes me hours to find a flight that works. And one of the things is to think about identity and intersections. So 10 years ago, I was willing to do that. And I have learned through time the impact on my body. And so from a health, like body age perspective, class has shifted a little bit for what I prioritize and what I value. And so I'm not like 6 o'clock flight means this body has to get up really early. And it's going to screw my just my cortisol levels are going to get messed up, right? like my comfort of my sleep. And so thank you for that. Cause I was like, oh yeah, I don't do that as much anymore. And there's these intersecting identities that we have to pay attention to, which is really important around social class, so that we know that it doesn't just navigate in isolation, but there are like these tensions and pieces, or this interweaving that has class be fluid and has other things, other pieces of who I am find some greater importance than, and I still have to be able to afford that $50. Right. And so again, it's not the either or, but it's the and what is important, more important. And that is really kind of this squeeze, right? What is important, what matters, what is acceptable, what am I willing to do differently? Yes. So I know we can go forever on this slide, and we have some other stuff. Ooh, Abby, I hear you come on, or I see you come on.
Yeah, I just noticed Kristen's comment in the chat too around, it sounds like the ways in which you make decisions now, it shifts because of your role and who you need to get home to, and the convenience around that too, right? That shifts all of our thinking around like, what are we willing to pony up more cash for when we have it, so that we can have more time with our families, which is what is most important to us.
Yep. Yeah. So we just encourage you to continue, and even going back to your staff meeting or a conversation with a colleague, or as you think about when students, whether it's a co-curricular or curricular space, come and say, hey, I'm having this struggle, or even paying attention for the signs of the struggle, I think are really important, because we've talked about a few issues, but it's wide and deep. as we think about the ways that COVID and the rising cost of living are really impacting students, whether it is basic needs related to housing and food security, childcare, transportation has been a huge one. I worked with a doc student last semester who was taking the commuter bus to campus. Well, the commuter bus stops at 6 p.m. She's a grad student. Our class is from 5 to 8 p.m. Right. And so that's an individual issue for her, but it's also a system structure issue for us as an institution, as we think about supporting students who are commuting from a nearby city or like those sorts of things as well. So how do we consider this not only on the individual level, but also on the systems and structure level as well? Abby, if you can go to the next slide for me. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on theory here, but wanted to mention this social class worldview model by William Liu, who's at the University of Maryland, and his colleagues. There's a 2004 version, which is what you're piece of which you're looking at here. There's also a 2011 version if you're interested in looking up more. But the sort of four pieces I wanted to pop out of this model were consciousness, attitudes, and saliency. So how often do we think about social class? How do we feel about it? And then sort of where is it in its level of importance to the other sort of pieces of our identity? And particularly right now with both COVID and the rising costs of living, I think this shifts for people, right? So as Becky was talking about the price of gas, I thought about my dad and my mom, my parents, who would often tell us, like when I was in high school, like go get $5 of gas, like go put $5 of gas in the car.
Right.
How far is that going to take them if you live in California right now, right? I don't know how far a gallon takes you. I don't know all that, but I can't imagine it's that far, right? And so thinking about whereas when gas was $2.49, that gets you double or almost double on your $5 bill, right? But not when it's $4.39 or whatever. And so that may shift and change over time. That consciousness, attitudes, and saliency. To Becky's point, if the person that you were depending on for financial security passed away from COVID, you probably have different levels of consciousness, attitudes, and saliency around your social class. And so thinking about that for yourself, thinking about that for your colleagues, for students on your campus, I think is important because even for some students, if it's not conscious, it's still present. And I appreciate that Becky often talks about social class is something that we never talk about and always talk about. And so that level of consciousness, sometimes it is like subconscious and sometimes it's directly conscious. And so how are we thinking about those things? Lifestyle, we've talked a lot about that, but our lifestyle ebbs and flows. And to Adrian's points about time and money and like those sorts of things. I drive a 2009 Toyota Corolla with manual locks and windows. And when I told one of my really good friends that I was pregnant, she's like, oh, you're going to have to buy a new car. And I was like, for what? Like the car still works. Like you can put the car seat in that car. It's just fine. And a kid's going to do nothing but ruin a car full of, crumbs and stuff. And so like, why would I do that? And then, but then if somebody calls me and says, hey, we want to take this trip, I'm more likely to say, yeah, like, let's think about it. Let's buy a flight. Like, let's do those things. And so making choices about how we spend our time and money, if we have one job, if we have multiple jobs, what we're willing to sort of, again, that sort of cost benefit analysis around those different forms of capital and which forms we're willing to spend and which forms we're not, or how do we spend those forms to build other forms and those sorts of things. Our relationships to property, which is some of what I was just talking about, which is our relationships to stuff, right? And so as we think about students coming to our campuses, the image that comes to my mind here is move in. And how some students put all their stuff in their sort of trusty car they've had for 15 years, right? Or their family's had for 20 years, and they drive up to campus by themselves with their car full of stuff. And I've seen other students drive up to campus with a mini U-Haul attached to their parents' vehicle, unloading things like monograms and special things, like all of these things. And those two students might be roommates. And so how is that going to play out? Right, in the residence hall? How is that going to play out between a commuter student and a residential student? All of those sorts of things, or the assumption that we make that everybody has a smartphone or everybody has a tablet or everybody has a laptop. And so as we think about even how we have students sign up to attend things, or say we're doing some sort of curriculum in a leadership program, and we're like, what is the thing called where you take the picture and it shows up on your phone? The QR code. Like take a picture of the QR code. And they're like, I don't have a device to be able to do that. Yes. And so how have we thought about our relationships to stuff which is not a very eloquent way to say it, but that's what it is. And how that it impacts our social class experience individually and then also collectively. And then finally, behavior, how we walk, talk, eat, dress can also be changed by some of these things because, and this can be challenging, particularly on college campuses, because students sometimes have ways that they learn to be more consistent across sort of student populations, because maybe it's the thing to wear vintage on your campus. Well, then it may or may not show up in terms of clothing as much, or, that there's certain language or lingo students pick up as being part of a campus community, or they code switch, right? They code switch their clothing, they code switch their language. And so a lot of these things, those I want to pull those out because I think those are always present in terms of social class worldviews, but I think we're seeing more fluidity and shifting because of some of these impacts of COVID and the rising costs as well.
Yeah. And Christina, thank you for putting in the chat, right? Just the simple questions that can take place that may not be so simple. So where are you going for spring break? What did you do this summer? What did you do over like the holiday break or the winter break? The assumptions that folks have. And when I say assumptions that folks have, right, it can be those of us that are sitting in office spaces, right? Because that is either where our class of origin sits, or that's where our current class sits. And not only with that question with students, but also with our colleagues, right? And how that plays itself out, and then how we can or can't engage it, and what's our comfort or what's our discomfort around that. Like, it's like, oh, I worked, okay, then I'll go to the next thing, right? Of really, how does this question land on folks? And then how can we, and I'll continue to say, build our capacity. How can we practice having these conversations and doing this work? Yeah. Yeah, vintage. I like the vintage example, Sandra, because can we then tell what is vintage, right? Or what's the hand-me-downs?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And it has a lot to do with, trends on college campuses, right? Or even the assumption, and this one I haven't heard as much probably in the last 5 years, but like, oh, all college students are poor, or they all eat ramen to survive. And, and that's not in actuality for many students. Like, it may be a preference or like a something you pick up, like, oh, this is what college students eat, so I'm going to eat this, whether or not that's like a need for you. But yeah, all the things in the chat about assuming breaks are fun. Like, I would often think like, what break? Like I'm work all break, or, caregive all break, or all of those sorts of things, or assumptions about coffee and happy hours. Becky and I wrote a chapter about that. Like, I'm not going to go to $8 coffee with you. Like, that doesn't work for me. Number one, I don't drink coffee. But number two, I'm not going to pay $8 for coffee. And so, even practices around, happy hour, and not just in terms of cost and like time, but also in terms of like, people being, in recovery, and what does that mean for people? And so, all of those sorts of things, splitting bills. Oh, Abby, I hate that. We're going to go over time, but Zeb and his friends sometimes play meal, like restaurant roulette, where they all put their credit cards in. And since I've been with him, I'm like, absolutely not. We are not going to pay for all these jokers meals when they're ordering all these things that I would never order, because I don't want to pay for them. And so all of those types of things, I think are really important. And then subsequently, what we sort of want to end with, and we know we don't have time, but I'll offer you this as sort of food for thought, something to chew on. If we can go to the next slide, Abby, is having us think about, and this may be, like I said, is food for thought to take back to your office, your team, yourself, however that's going to work for you. But as we think about social class identity and how it's showing up in our spaces, what are we doing to alleviate some of the pressure and tension and squeeze? And what can we do? And so, some campuses, lots of campuses right now are pointing to food pantries or housing security programs, particularly during break times for students who either do not have somewhere safe to go or can't return to somewhere specific, or those sorts of things. Some campuses are starting better childcare programs or better transportation. some two-year institutions have done amazing work around bringing governmental services to campus, or pre-qualifying students for governmental services, food programs, childcare programs, those sorts of things. And so, what are we doing? So what is within, and I often think about this, what is within our sphere of influence? So if you're working in a leadership office, what are you doing to expand access to your programs to people with different time constraints, right? Or different linguistic abilities, or like those sorts of things. If you are working in housing, right? What does that look like for you? If you're at a nonprofit, doing work, what does that look like for you? So what are we currently doing? So pat ourselves on the back for what we're currently doing and challenge ourselves to think about what can we do. And that's sometimes as easy as having the conversation with students to say, hey, like, tell me what's really up, right? I think about that from the lens of, you haven't read for class. Is it because you don't have the book? Is it because you can't access the materials? Have I created a situation where you can't get the learning materials that you need to be able to be engaged in this course, right? Or, you're not coming, you signed up for this event and you didn't come. Let's not just make an assumption that people are willy-nilly about that, right? And so it may have been that, their childcare didn't work out for them, or, they had to pick up an extra shift at their job. And so how are we asking those critical questions so that we understand what is within our sphere to shift, change, or add to make our programs and services more accessible related to social class.
Yeah. And I would say if you're doing DE and IB work, any like diversity related work, add social class as an identity to talk about and to learn about. Right now, we do not see very much. We don't see campuses engaging in social class because we always talk about it and don't talk about it and have been told not to talk about it. And so add this to your framework as you do inclusion work. So very critical. And the first step is you gotta learn some content about yourself and about the subject matter. So that would be the add in regards to what we can do.
Yeah. So we could talk all day. We know we're at time, so we'll turn it back over to Abby and LeaderShape. Thank you for starting this conversation with us today, and we hope you continue it in all the spaces you're in.
Yeah, and thank you both. I feel like the ways in which you've opened the doors for us to have these conversations and to know what to ask and what to look out for and what to be aware of and what to consider when we're planning programs like this. I think back to, I was just at LEI and listening to a community college representative talk about planning a program on her campus. And part of it was not fundraising just to provide the program, but to provide childcare, to provide transportation, to not just feed the students while they were there, but to box up a meal for them to take home as well, because make this worth my time to be here when I had to take off work, when I had to step away from other responsibilities. So thank you for that. We truly, truly appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you all for joining us and for staying over a couple extra minutes too. It's a great conversation to have and a great way to dip your toe into the conversation around social class if this is new to you, and certainly to peel back the onion to get more meat out of it as we learn more about what to be on the lookout for and how to ask these questions and how to engage in these conversations. So thank you both so much for your time and expertise, Becky and Sanja. We truly, truly appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us here and for the questions and conversations and dialogue that you've invited into that chat space as well. We truly appreciate being in community with you all. LeaderShape is a non-for-profit organization. We'll continue to offer these spaces of virtual learning for free as we have these lunchtime series over and over again. But if you're so inclined to make a contribution to our nonprofit organization, there's a way for you to do that there. We have another session on Thursday with the Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington, and then another session on Friday with our fellow staff member and colleague Juan Mendizabal, who's on the session with us as well. And then next week we'll have a session with Kate Trevi from Marquette University and talking more about resilience. So thank you all for joining us. We'll send out a link to the recording to folks after we have all those recordings from even next week's session. And so we hope to get to see you all more on Thursday. But thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.